Hi friends, we are going to go on a tour of our sanctuary space. God is of course everywhere and ever present, and our prayer life and our relationship with God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit does not rely on a physical space, something that we are having to really dig deep into right now. But at the same time, across cultures, all across the world, people set apart particular places for remembering God and God's presence, for remembering our relationship with God and neighbor, and what we are called to do and be as disciples of our religious practice. Now, in our tradition, we tend to have very traditional looking buildings, although there are certainly many exceptions to that. And a lot of those buildings have changed over time. That said, we also have an affection for fancy names for things. Usually the other names for something have to do with either Old English or Old Latin or Old French. And part of the reason we continue to use these names for everyday things, use special names for everyday things, is to help to remind us that we are taking time to set ourselves apart for God and God's purpose, as God loves us and created us and calls us to love each other in God's name. So we're going to do a tour, and I'm going to tell you the fancy names for some things. So right here, what we're looking at right now, the entryway, which in everyday parlance would usually be called a foyer, in the church is called a narthex. Now, here's our baptismal font. Our baptismal font is put right where it should be. My guess is there was a different font that was somewhere else in this building at some point, but in the last 50 to 60 years, one of the most important works in the Episcopal Church has been reclaiming baptismal identity, are being baptized into Christ's life, his death, and his resurrection as the center of what it means to be a practicing Christian in the world. So this font being right between the two ways in which most people get into the church is incredibly beautiful. I once served at a church where the baptismal font was a big round shell-shaped thing that was probably 3 to 4 times the size of this. And when I first got to the church, it was in a different part of the building. And one of the things we did in my time there was we moved it to a space like this. And I'll never forget the member who said, "Wow, well now I have to trip over my baptism to come to church." Yes, you should be engaging your baptism whenever you come into worship. We do have these lovely windows. You'll notice there's some differences between them, and I am just going out on a wild limb guess that these windows and the ones behind the altar, which are darker, are probably newer. In general, newer stained glass is darker, and I'm wondering if any of you can guess the reason why. So, the space in which I am standing right now, this is called the nave. Nave as in navel, not as in orange, but as in belly button. It is the center of our Christian life and practice, the most important, most numerous group of people in all of Christianity are the average baptized practitioners. You are the life and blood and center of the work that we are doing, the congregation. Now, it looks like the most important people are the folks who are up at the altar and in the chancel, but that is purely a dynamic of how you build a building for a performance, for engaging a crowd with leaders. But this is the nave. It is the center, like our belly button on our bodies. Now, there's also another connection with nave in that sanctuaries like ours are built to look like an overturned boat, recalling the stories of Jesus on boats, also remembering Noah's Ark. As we move forward, we are going to come up to the side. Some people would call these transepts. If you were to draw a picture of this building from above, you would find it to be in a cruciform shape, in that it sort of imitates the shape of a cross. And that is, of course, intentional for fairly obvious reasons. Now, most church buildings in the ancient world, particularly in ancient Rome, usually as they got were adapted from old Roman meeting buildings, which were in this elongated style because it works from a natural sound position. It's not a matter of saying, oh, these people up here in the front are high up and these people down here are down below. It's a matter of how sound works in a building without amplification. If you see a sanctuary that is round or square and does not have a rounded ceiling, you're probably looking at a sanctuary that is either very small or was created after sound amplification. Most ancient churches are built to amplify sound at the best possible way with a natural voice. So there's a tradition in the church that I think started because some kid asked a question and some priest made up an answer, and it is just stuck. There are a couple of things in church life that I'm pretty sure that's the case. Anyways, we talk about gospel side and epistle side. Now, it is not like something being starboard side or stern or bow or port side on a boat. It's not always the same, because what happens is whatever side the lectern is on is the epistle side. It's that way because that's where we read the epistle, the letters, from. We also read the Old Testament lessons, but reading of Old Testament lessons is a more modern phenomena. So, epistle side because of the lectern. Gospel side because that's where we proclaim good news. If it's got a pulpit, it's the gospel side. Now, in modern church buildings that are following the best advice of liturgical theologians, liturgy basically means the work of Christ and the work of people, and is how we talk officially about what we do in prayer, in worship, in our style of doing that. Anyways, so liturgical theologians, there's also liturgical science, if you didn't know that. Liturgical theologians would suggest that we should have one place from which we proclaim the gospel and the letters and preach, because of a sense of there not being separate. I mean, you can look at this and you can say, well, one's a bigger deal than the other, clearly. Like, our lectern is brass and it's clearly special, but it's not as big and special as the pulpit. So we want to, going forward, possibly look at creating more balance in the nonverbal signals of our furniture. That said, it does create a nice balance in the building. So, side transepts. As we come up here, this whole center area where the altar is the chancel. Okay? Chancel, not the most important word. I would much rather you be a thoroughgoing disciple of Jesus, living into your baptismal vows, knowing what those are, than knowing any of these terms. That said, if you're an acolyte, sometimes things will go smoother if you know the terms that are coming out of the priest's mouth. So, chancel. Altar, clearly. Now, one of the things the younger people in this group would not remember, I don't even remember, is that it used to be that altars were against the back wall, and the priest would have said Holy Communion with the back to the crowd and his face, and it was a he back then, facing the altar that was up against that wall. A little bit, certainly much more like what we have in our current side chapel. Liturgical theologians, knowing more about what the early church did and diving deeply into our understanding of ourselves and our worship practices, said, oh my gosh, this is everybody's supper. You do not invite people over to dinner and then turn your back to them. So, for many reasons, but that's the easiest explanation, we brought the altars out. And some of the friends in this class, since I'm new here and I haven't had this answered, but I can guess, my guess is this was a new altar table that was built just for pulling the altar out from the back. And I am delighted that we are a church that has people receiving in the round, just because it makes it so that we are a circle of God's saints receiving communion and receiving blessings together. So, altar. This is the bishop's chair. You can tell it is the bishop's chair because it has a bishop's mitre carved into it. Now, frankly, as long as the bishop isn't here, anyone who wants to sit there can sit there, I think. But it's actually not a very comfortable seat to sit in if you're my size. Anyway, so that's the cathedral. It's actually not a cathedral, but it is a bishop's chair. But the reason a cathedral is because it has the bishop's official cathedra in it. So this is just like a representative of that. Once again, we like fancy words and fancy names. This, of course, is the choir, where the choir sits and sings. Now, we were talking before, if you want to have good sound quality through a building, this building is actually very well made for that. The best sound quality happens when I am speaking right here and it is bouncing off of that marble and it is bouncing a little bit up here and going out that way. It's very well designed for that. Thank goodness when my mic does not work properly, usually because of user error. So a couple more things up here and then we will be done. This is called an ambry. Now, in a fun little Episcopal liturgical people thing, because it is in the wall, it is an ambry. If it were a box that was sitting outside a wall, that was hung on the wall like a picture, it would be called a tabernacle. Now, entertainingly, they both do the same thing. A tabernacle and an ambry do the same things. It's just one is an innie and one is an outie. The outie is a tabernacle. This is an ambry. And in the ambry, it gives really good signals about what's in there. We keep the reserve sacraments, so bread and wine that has already been blessed. We have not emptied that out yet since we've had to stop sharing communion because of the COVID virus. Because this is Holy Week, we will be clearing that out and committing it back to God into the ground. That's one of the things that happens. I'll show you the special sink in a second. But we do keep reserve sacrament. Sometimes you'll see that I go over to get some of that because I've had leftovers before and I am running short at the time of distribution on a certain Sunday. Sometimes I'm doing that on purpose because you don't want to be keeping the bread in there forever. It does go stale eventually. That said, the last thing I wanted to point out to you is this room over here is called the sacristy. It's where we keep the sacred things, like where we get ready with the linens and the bread and the wine and the so on. And here you see two sinks. This sink is the normal sink, hand washing, dishwashing sink. You can see the soap for hand washing. You can see the dish soap for dish soaping. It goes straight into the sewer system like most sinks. This is a piscina, which is pretty much Latin for pool or sink. And this is where we would put any wine or water that's already been blessed, and it goes straight down into the ground. If you ever want to have a plumber look at you weirdly, say, yeah, I need a sink with a drain that goes straight into the ground, not into the sewer system. They will look at you like you were nuts. Anyway, so this has been your tour of the nave and the sacristy, and we're going to talk more about it now.